Honor to bring back one of the most unsung musicians, world musicians, and he brought so much of that creativity and spirit to the United States at a much more flexible time in music, in the music industry. Not that things were perfect, but he was able to sing for his supper, and we had a very delightful first conversation. George Wadenius, welcome back to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Thank you.
You know, I wanted to ask you about, I've done several interviews with John McLaughlin. I rest in peace. I did a couple interviews with Larry Coryell, Pat Martino. All these guys, I mean, especially John. I mean, there was this period of time in the late '60s where Carlos Santana. I haven't interviewed him, but you know, there was a lot of these guys were seeing their friends become roadkill because of the drug use,
Right.
and a lot of them wanted to find salvation through spirituality and without getting blasted out of their minds. And I remember John sort of going to Sufi dances in Queens, and Paul Motion was there, and then eventually connected with Sri Chimnoy. And the only reason I bring this up is because you did an album that I don't know, I can't find it online anywhere, but it directly relates to the Transcending the Cycle of Birth and Death, Samsara music band. And I kind of wanted...
Oh, right.
Yeah.
That's right.
I wanted you to talk about your spiritual inclinations. I mean, ultimately, you've always had an open heart. I mean, the mere fact that you were, making children's music at a time when it's just so hip. Everything was hip. But I have to believe that I just would like you to talk to the audience about your evolution as a spiritual being.
Well, I've always been a little reluctant to go deeply into the, what should we say, main religions. You know, I always felt that even from a young age, even though I grew up in, it's a Lutheran country, Sweden.
Right.
So it's and that's a pretty rigid religion, in a sense. If you do something wrong, you're condemned forever. It's not like the Catholic religion where you can get absolved for anything, almost.
I know,
or at least you get forgiven. And I just didn't feel that. It didn't speak to me. I mean, I wasn't, I sang in church choirs and I did all of that stuff when I was young, but it was more because of the interest in music than the spiritual or the religious aspect of it. And then I kind of read about Eastern religions because I found it very interesting, and kind of found that there were so many similarities basically in the good parts of the religions, the good parts about, do unto others what you want them to do to you, or don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you,
Yeah.
And just, growing up with the sense of that, what I did have from my home was a strong sense of fairness, or a strong sense of treating people equally and fairness, and you shouldn't be dishonest and those kind of things, So even though I haven't always lived up to that, but it's been at the core of my being anyway, and I'm trying always, So would
you say that would you say that because the monotheistic religions are really like you said, some of them that like where you grew up in Sweden, I mean, you were banished to the side. You were done for life if you sinned, and I just wonder, did you develop? I know that as a Taoist, I mean, I my name is very Jewish, but my mom was Catholic, my dad was Jewish, and I didn't really have a spiritual transmission until I received the Tao, which is a Eastern philosophy, way of life. It's not really a religion, but it changed my life, and it sent me more towards my true nature and away from my habitual nature. And I just wonder, being that everything was coming at you, maybe you were so like caught up in having a ball that it didn't matter. But did you gravitate towards any kind of Eastern spirituality, especially when you first moved to New York?
Well, I did read Paramahansa Yogananda's book.
Yeah.
You know, what is it? The
Autobiography of a yogi. Yeah.
Autobiography, exactly, of a yogi.
Yeah.
And I found that really interesting. And I did go to some meetings with some friends with that too, but I didn't have the discipline really to do the meditations and whatever you need to do, you know. And for me, always playing has been my religious experience in a sense, you know. It's like that has moved me to a different place. That has, you know, in the best of musical experiences, you forget time, you forget where you are, you're just totally in the thing, you know. And even though it certainly doesn't happen all the time, but the moments that it happen, it's really what is more of a religious experience for me than anything else. You know, the old books. You know, I remember when my wife was dying, and I was going and I was speaking to a priest also in Oslo, and he asked me if I believed in the Bible, and so I you know, my inclination was to tell him that, you know, this book has been rewritten X amount of times over 2,000 years, right? And which version should we believe, and to what extent should we actually critically look at it and say this is what the people in power wanted to control the rest of the population with at the time, you know. So I can't really go that route, you know. It seems to me a little, well, maybe not so smart, you know, or maybe I shouldn't, you know. People are religious for various reasons, and some are very smart, but you know,
well, I mean, no, you were being, I think you were being honest. I mean, what would you have said to him? I completely believe in the Bible, just because, I mean, I would like you to talk a little bit, this is really important, just because as a Taoist, the work that I'm doing and the path that I'm on is, you know, it's all about transcending the cycle of birth and death and trying to inspire other people to be themselves. And I wanted you to talk about, I think it's really important because a lot of people will never tell you how they feel about you. Even if they love you or respect you deeply, it's very hard to communicate that. And unfortunately, a lot of people leave this planet with no closure. And I would love you to talk about how, I mean, Neil Cassidy, who was one of the Merry Pranksters with Ken Kesey, I mean, he always said, grace beats karma. And I just wanted you to talk about the closure you had with your late wife and how important it was for you to have meaningful closure.
Well, with her, it's hard to describe, but she was the first grown-up woman that actually loved me unconditionally. And that was something I never got at home from my mother or from my grandmother, and or from my first wife, and not because necessarily it was her fault. It was just at the time I wasn't in a place where I could allow that either, you know. So it, you know, it's like I couldn't receive it. I couldn't be vulnerable when I was younger, you know, because I was too scared and I was too. I still had a lot of growing to do, you know. So, and this is also when I did the gigs with Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and it's also when I was in New York and did all those great gigs and everything, but I still wasn't feeling particularly well inside of myself, you know. So it's when I met her really that I could rest in myself and start to think that I was an okay person, you know, and that and I could also realize that things I had done at different points in life, which had really kind of sabotaged I had sabotaged myself, was because of the little 4 or 5-year-old boy inside of me that was abandoned basically by his parents, right? And constant and has always walked around thinking that there's something wrong with me. And she was the one that gave me closure on that, because I certainly started acting up like that with her too, and she would tell me that that was not okay, but she would also let me know that she loved me anyway, but if I wanted to be with her, I would have to re-examine why I did what I did and try to figure out if that's the person I wanted to be, or if I wanted to be a different person. And so it took me a couple of years, and I finally found that little 4-year-old boy, and once I did, I kind of it kind of lifted the big burden from me. I just felt that, okay, I got this, and I understand why I have it, and I have this little person inside of me, and I understand why I do it, and when situations arise, which they always will, where this little boy tries to step in and say something really stupid or act out really in a stupid way, then at this point, I'm not totally dumbfounded by it. Things just happen.
Yeah.
And I've been like, did I do that? Why did I do that? And I didn't understand it at all when I was younger. And now I can see it coming, and I can say, okay, we're not going to go that route,
I love this, man.
So, yeah, it's really
It's deep, man. It's really deep. I almost feel like there's a sonic mirror here. I mean, I'm not a musician, but I was married for 13 years and have 2 beautiful children, and it definitely grounded me, but there wasn't unconditional love in the marriage. And I just feel like that, like God is love. I mean, unconditional love, that is, you were saved. Right. You were probably saved at that point. She was a savior for you.
Absolutely. She was the most wonderful person. She was really very, very wise, very beautiful from the inside out.
Sure.
It's so yeah, definitely. Well,
do you have like a memory of obviously you began to cultivate your true nature with her, and you were able to then identify the little child inside of you, and it would still pop up periodically. But if you have a defining memory of her, especially in New York, the cost of living was pretty reasonable, but you were playing pretty esoteric music. You weren't a guy who was, at the Brill Building 90 hours a week. Did she stuck by you even when financially times were not easy?
Well, the thing is, this is later in life,
Right.
When I lived in New York, I was married to an American woman. Yeah, and this woman I met in the end of the 80s when I was over in Norway. I had run into her before because she was actually married when she was very young. She was married to the bass player Arild Andersen.
Wow.
Are you familiar with the quartet from Norway with Jan Garbarek and Jon Christensen?
Oh, I know Jan. Not that. Well, did it have? What was the name of the quartet?
Oh well. I think I don't remember I think it was Jan Garbarek's quartet. Yeah. Actually, it was with a guitar player named Terje Ripdahl. It was
absolutely
with Arild Andersen on bass,
burning.
With Jon Christensen, who plays on some of the most memorable Keith Jarrett recordings, right. And they all worked through East EM at the time, in the 70s. And she was married to him. So we met actually in New York in the mid 70s, but then she was married to him and there was nothing, no sparks flying between us, right. And then I met her again in the end of the 80s. So I was married to my American wife, in the end of the 70s and during the 80s when I was doing all those things. And I ended up doing mainly commercial work from like the mid 80s, or from 84 or 83, 84, playing on a lot of jingles and that kind of thing, because there was this constant pressure on me to make a lot of money.
You had kids at that point, right?
And I was not feeling good.
Right.
Yeah. I had the little children, and I also had the I was offered to go out with Paul Simon for half a year after I toured with Simon and Garfunkel in '82, and I had to really make a decision then. First of all, I had started to establish myself in New York, so I was starting to make good money for the first time in my life, and then it was also reminding myself that my mother left to study piano playing in Paris for a year when I was 4 years old, right? And my father was not, he had left when I was 1. So I was just kind of parked with my grandparents, right? And that's how I look back and see that that's the period of my life when I was really kind of hurt, and when I mean, nobody did this probably intentionally, but the end result was that I felt abandoned, and I was a very scared kid all through my upbringing after that, I didn't want to do that to my children, right? When they were 2 and 5, and I got that offer to tour with Paul, so I turned that down.
Wow.
Or actually, I asked for so much money that I knew I wouldn't get the gig. So,
but I mean, that was great. That was beyond graceful. I mean, so you were, then you reconnected with this woman who was married to the Norwegian guy. Is that right?
Yeah, just by coincidence.
Of course, it's always like that.
Yeah, and she was not married to him anymore. She had a marriage in between that was also not very good at all for her. I mean, he was like a psychopath, and he was also a musician, a folk musician, and he had really scared her to the point where she barely even dared to go out, for the risk of running into him somewhere, and when we met, it was just like it was a very spiritual. That was definitely a very spiritual experience. I mean, because of what she had gone through with her second husband, she didn't want to. She was finished with men, basically, right? But since we had met in the 70s, she figured we were friends, and it wasn't, so we could get together anyway, So she invited me for dinner, right? And if you can look back at who I was when I was 10, 15 years old, when I was 15, I was like a 10-year-old. And when I was 20, socially and emotionally, I was like a 15-year-old, right? Because of my parents not giving me any kind of a social, role models or anything, right? So I when I was 15, I had this kind of daydream that I always remembered somewhere, that I would meet a very beautiful woman. She would be my best friend. And I got this really warm, fuzzy feeling in my heart that this is what I would love, And when I have dinner with her, after we sit and talk in this couch, and I look at her and I get this feeling, and I recognized it, and that was 30 years later, right? So something told me that this is the woman for you,
Wow.
And, and I lived in the States, and I was just over to do a gig in Norway, and I was unhappy, and I didn't feel particularly good with my life over there, and with my family life with my wife, but you have kids, and you try to make the best of it, So then it took a couple of years before we actually got together, but I could not forget that moment,
Well, no, I mean, I'm really honored that you shared that that story. I mean, it's funny just because I've been sort of dealing with a little bit of a bug here. I remember my dear brother, the drummer Chris Parker, when
Yeah.
he was doing an Alan Toussaint gig in New Orleans, and he shared a Howard Johnson with another musician who had pneumonia. And by the end of the couple of days or however long they were down there for, Chris was really sick, and so he's flying back to New York. And obviously, I know it's a place you were hanging at. The word got out that McKell's was happening, and that the night he was flying back in, the band was getting together: Gordon Edwards, Cornell Dupree, Steve Gadd, and so Chris is like literally walking dead, and he's like, "There's no way I'm going to miss this gig," and he gets up on the bandstand. And all he can think about is getting into bed. He's that sick. And he plays for hours and gets off the bandstand. And people came up to him and said, "Dude, I have never heard you play like that, ever." It was like desperation. Yeah. And part of that is like what you talk about, this feeling that you have inside. That's the warm, fuzzy feeling that is spiritual. And the point is you have to rely on your life force in order to get through some of that stuff. I mean, do you recall a time when you were physically far from 100% and you were just so determined to find some...
Oh, yeah.
Where you just... And people were like, where did that come from? Because you were completely out of your thinking mind.
Sure. I remember playing with, God knows if I had 102, 103 degree fever. But, the show had to go on, kind of, right? So I was playing a gig, and I get off the bandstand, and I'm fine,
That's right. It's the healing. That's the healing part of it.
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
I wasn't sick anymore. It's like, what? What happened,
How do you, is that, I know you're not a scientist, although you were on a doctor's path, or at least that's what your grandparents or your folks kind of... can you talk about the frequencies that allow you to... because it's not like you're, on that gig when you had 103 fever, show must go on, and it's just like getting that chi or that life force or that swell where it's like, is there a way to describe how you could possibly become healthy after? I realize that you go back to the way back, to Brazil. Ayrton, I'm not sure when you crossed paths with him, but his dad was a musical healer. And so, they were doctors and rhythm. And I just kind of wanted you to talk about that kind of magic in music, because in so many places today, the amount of emphasis based on performance and perfection and facility and technique. And it's like, that's cool. But it's really more about raising the universal vibration, and that's not a corny thing to say. It's just like, it's about the conversation on the bandstand. And I want you to talk about, as a musician, how metaphysically, how healing that is.
Well, the thing is, I at the time when I experienced these things, I didn't really intellectualize around it. It was more like... I'm really sick. I'm going to do this gig. You just focus on the music completely.
Exactly.
You go in and you just focus totally on that without thinking that you're going to get well or without thinking anything really. And you focus on what people around you are doing. And you do the thing, and then it's almost like you're surprised, when you like come off the stage and you're not sick anymore, and how did that happen, so it's definitely some kind of a healing power and some kind of alignment of energies, that's really beneficial, that happens.
Would you say that when you talk about being completely immersed in the music, especially when you're under the weather, you're completely listening to everyone around you?
Yeah, definitely.
Right? That's the healing force, because then it becomes like a menagerie or just some sort of collage of sound. And then you get that synesthesia. Do you find yourself still sort of feeling blue sometimes? And then even an acoustic solo gig, you you burn through it, and all of a sudden you. I'm not talking about mood. I'm talking about physically. That stays with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's like, this is not like a perfect science of any kind at all. I still today find myself here when I'm down in Nice. I'll just sit in with some guys and jam,
Right.
and sometimes we just play cover tunes, and sometimes we'll kind of groove on a thing for a while, and be open. It can go almost anywhere. And when we did it with a group made in Sweden, that was very open. That was very open ended, and a lot of listening, even though we didn't maybe have as much knowledge, or we didn't really, our repertoire or where we could take the music was not that deep, I would say. But it had a lot of energy, right? And just the other night, I played with these guys, and it got into that kind of a thing, and I realized that sometimes, still to this day, I have to be very observant of myself, so I don't focus too much on what I'm doing myself.
Right. Right. Get out of your own way. Right.
But that I'm still open for what's going on around.
I love
me,
it, man.
To kind of hook on to something else, or find a little cool part with something that somebody else is doing, or something like that. So it's great. It's great fun. It's like my playmates. These other guys.
Can you talk about the? I mean, I'm doing more looking into you. What's so? I mean, I've tried to covet as many world musicians. That's why I'm just so honored to be able to connect with you. And all these guys that I remember seeing on records, Rune Gustafsson, Bjorn, Jason Lynn. I mean,
oh yeah.
I mean, you can say that you were maybe emotionally immature when you were young, but
right.
if you were really that, unstable or immature, I don't think part of the bread's got to be good. And the hang's got to be good, So it's like, I don't think you were that. Looking back on it, maybe you weren't the most mature person in the world, but you played with all the cats, man. And I just would love you.
I did.
Yeah, and it's just like, can you talk about, if as best you can, because I mean, Gustafsson was, I forget the label here, but he was. I mean, these guys, I see their records all the time. And
it was probably on the Metronome label.
That's right, exactly. That's exactly right.
Which was later bought up by Warner, but that was it. I played on a couple of his albums, actually. We played one where we did the like the Four Brothers, or the Brothers Four. Where he was playing the leads and I'm playing the second or third part, and this other guitar player, Janne Schaffer, who was also very influential, because he played with ABBA later on, and with some other really prominent people in Sweden, and a good player. And he's also had his own style at the time. In some ways, I would think that if he had gotten the opportunities I got, and we could have switched places almost. But we did that album, and then I played bass on an album with Rune, which I think is called Rune at the Top or something like that.
Rune at the Top. That's right. That's the album, and I don't think I realized that you played bass on that.
Pat Metheny listened to and got inspired by. Actually,
I believe.
Yeah, but I played electric bass on that, and Jon Christensen actually played drums on it. So it was all a lot of, I was at the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s, I was really involved in a lot of stuff that happened in Stockholm.
Well, I was going to say that if the best you can, I don't know if you ever crossed paths with the quite an amazing drummer, Norman Connors, and he talked about in Philly, 5 or 6 years old, growing up and going to Peps or the Showboat, and the Regal. I mean, musicians were seen in the same light as doctors. I mean, there was a lot of gravitas, and I think if you were a jazz musician specifically, and I kind of wanted you to talk about what the essence was. I mean, because jazz was still a relatively popular music in the late 60s in the United States. I mean, you had a lot of crossover. You had the Jazz Crusaders, you had Les McCann, so you had some of that
Yeah.
R&B stuff, but jazz was still a popular music. It was also very much like with Joe Henderson earlier, it was a social consciousness music. What
Right.
how would George Wadenius describe the essence of that jazz music that was pulsating with all these cats in Stockholm in the late 60s?
Well, I don't know. I didn't have such a conscious relationship to it. I just loved to play, and people wanted me to have them, to play with them, And I played more bass actually with these people than I played guitar,
Wow.
And it was really when I got the gig with Blood, Sweat and Tears that I kind of decided that maybe I should really be a guitar player.
Why did you make that decision?
Because that's, then I would play guitar all the time, with Blood, Sweat and Tears. We played 250 gigs a year, we made albums, and we had Jim Fielder first and then Ron McClure on bass, so I just kind of didn't play bass then for quite a while. I did play bass then later on when we had this band in the mid 70s, which was a great band called the Gladas Kapell. I don't know if you know about this.
Whoa! What is? Please break that down.
De Gladas. It means the first word is DE, and then the next word is GLADAS. De Gladas, and the last word is Kapell. Kapell. And we played music from this guy who would later be a really, really prominent film composer named Stefan Nilsson. He wrote some beautiful, beautiful music later on. But he had written these kind of crazy songs, and I was playing bass on them. And you should listen to this stuff. You won't.
Please send me some clips. I mean, is there stuff on YouTube? You got to send me some stuff.
There is stuff. Yeah, I could send you a link.
Yeah, please send me a link. Sure. I would love. I mean, this was 75-ish. Yeah. What years was this?
77 or 78, actually. Yeah.
I want to read you this quote from Dave Bargeron from our interview. He said, the band hated to do overdubs about Blood, Sweat, and Tears. The Columbia producers wanted perfection. They wanted to isolate the horns and separate them and play with the rhythm section. We would go in the studio, and the first thing we would do was work up a tune so that it was absolutely acceptable as a full performance live in the room. The whole band. We were cooking and ready to do it. Not adding little pieces with overdubs and that BS. We created the thing live in the studio. Only then would we take it apart and record it real quick, piece by piece, so they could get it clean. I convinced the band that this was the way to do it because then we could play this stuff live. Do you, what was, I mean, especially on your solo, when you became a leader in your own right, can you just talk about your, I mean, you obviously have been in the studio quite a bit, but I just wonder in your mind, what is, the thing I miss the most is just, and I'm not an engineer, but it's just the idea that there's this sort of lack of human connection hitting at the same time. Can you talk about, as a leader, your methodology as it related to recording your albums?
Well, the albums that I've recorded, basically from the 70s and the 80s, I think we all recorded them live, basically, and there might have been some overdubs of some extra guitars, or I might have decided that I wanted to have a couple of shots at a solo and left that open, but essentially that's what we did. We recorded it live, but then of course, it's like there's a certain kind of comfort in knowing that if I really blow something and it doesn't sound good, everybody else doesn't have to record the whole damn thing again. So it's like, which I also think makes today's recording not as interesting, because the nerve of having to do it right then and there isn't there anymore. You can kind of go in and make an overdub on something, and if there's a note or a couple of notes that are kind of not great, you can fix it, and that wasn't so easy to do, back when we worked direct to tape, and if you wanted to change a part of a solo, you would have to erase what was there already, so, but whereas today you can do it 100 times and then pick whatever you think is the best, but it also means that you're not as focused or as on your toes, when you do it the first time with the band,
Would you say that first time, that first take, second take, was something that was just instilled in you, even though you weren't consciously connected to, here I am thinking like you're so Ella Fitzgerald and Duke Ellington, and there's all this social justice component to it, but I think more to the point, jazz is a first take music, and you talk about that the nerve. Can you go a little bit deeper on the nerve?
Well, it's hard. I don't know. It's hard to describe it, but it's like you're extremely focused, and you're very open to, the moment you've played through it once, you also know in your head that, hey, I did that on the bridge there, that was a cool thing. I'll do that again,
Right.
And so now that you come to that bridge, you're trying to recreate something that you did the first time, and a lot of the times when you work it like that, sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it just makes it maybe a little less spontaneous, I don't know how to put it in another way.
No, I think it's spot on. The other cat that I wanted to ask you about, because he had his own individual style. That was the other thing about jazz. It's just, instead of having a homogenization of sound, it's hard to tell who people are today. Everybody had their individual sound back when. And this guy, even though he was in Germany, were you hip to Volker Krieger?
No, I don't know.
That name doesn't ring a bell. Because that was coming out of, he was, Wolfgang Downer and all these. It was just such a beautiful. There was just so much going on, and yet we weren't interconnected. And I think, in some ways, who knows, George? If in today's world, you might have been, it's almost a blessing that you had to work through all your insecurities and you were allowed to do it without being put on medication or put in an institution or, you didn't cause any problems. And I, before my recorder runs out, I have to ask you about this cat because I just believe that you must have connected with him early on. He's one of my favorite people. I never met him, but actually his father, his folks, and lived next to the Parkers, Chris Parker and his family in New York. And this guy, Jeremy Steig.
Oh, Jeremy Steig.
Steig, man. Steig was, do you remember the first time you actually, that dude was doing some of the most experimental stuff before you got to New York. But I know you recorded with him in the 90s, but that dude.
Yeah, I did actually record him because Walter Becker produced an album with him. Wow. And he asked me to participate with that, This was when I had played on the Kamikyriad album.
Right.
And I was going to play with Steely Dan, It was in those years, But I didn't really know his music or his experimenting that well. The studio scene was kind of strange at that point because he had his wife with him when we recorded, and she was kind of basically deciding everything. It's like,
it's a drag right there.
Seems like Jeremy really, it was just totally under her thumb.
He capitulated to everything she wanted. That's interesting.
Yeah, it seemed like it. And it was almost like, wow, it was a little hard to see, but I mean, I could have been there, another couple of years earlier, I could have been there too, so what the hell.
George, before, free association, for those, I mean, you came to the States and it was the pioneering time of Return to Forever, Mahavishnu, Weather Report, all these amazing musicians. And I just remember Michael Shreve in one of our interviews, the drummer from Santana, he saw Billy Cobham play, and the force of Cobham threw him up against the wall. And you could have walked out of there and said, I'll never be like that, and get down on yourself. But Michael said, I'm going to be myself. What's your advice to younger cats who get kind of mentally psyched out based, and just what are the most important things and antecedents to become yourself on the bandstand?
Wow. That's a hard one because people are so different.
They are.
Some people are, like an Yngwie Malmsteen, can do the most amazing things, but probably not play the simplest song,
Right.
And then you have all these other players who are really, really solid players, but they might not have that personal thing that really sticks out, but they work, and they're very solid, in all kinds of musical styles, and so, I think to begin with, I was more one that wanted to do my own thing, or was doing my own thing, really, with the Made in Sweden groups, and also with the stuff that I did with Blood, Sweat and Tears to some extent, and other bands. But then as I worked through the 80s and I worked in the studio a lot, I became more like one of those guys who tried to be solid at anything, right? And it was a learning process, and it was in a lot of ways a good learning process. But one of the things that I always regretted was that in 1975, when I was about to quit Blood, Sweat and Tears, I was actually offered from, what was his name, Randy Dallahan or something like that.
Right.
He was like the guitar teacher down in Miami at the time, University of Miami,